So hello everyone, my name's Dr Sam Bizley and I'm a lecturer in pharmacy at the University of Reading. Now my specialism is actually in formulation science, which is the science of taking active chemicals known to have activity in the body and actually manipulating those into a form that we can actually take. Now this got me thinking, obviously in the community we're often looking forward and looking at making more sophisticated or more complex formulations, but actually we can learn a lot from the past. So what I'd like to take you through today is actually how the subjects evolved throughout history. So I've called this Pharmacy Through the Ages, so let's have a look where really pharmacy began. So when we're talking about pharmacy, a lot of people probably think about pharmacists in their local communities and the sorts of roles that pharmacists have in providing healthcare and supply of medication to patients. Now this has only really been part of their role and only continues to be part of their role, either throughout history and actually even today. You can have practitioners that have focuses on pharmacology, so this is the study of the biological activity of medicines, pharmaceutics, which is all about the design and analysis of drug formulations, or pharmaceutical chemistry, which is that initial design of those drug molecules themselves. Now each of these components has developed considerably over time, so we can go back a long way and we can find actually our first recordings of it, and it still develops up until this very day. Now your first question, kind of the remit of what I wanted to talk to you about today was, where did it all begin, I suppose? Now unfortunately I'd love to give you a sort of very precise answer, but in reality we don't quite know exactly where pharmacy first originates from. We can only go from the recordings that we have found, and these are probably a bit later than it actually first starts. So where I can actually take you back to first of all is actually 2600 BC, so 4,500 years ago, so a long time, in the area of, or the kingdom, the ancient kingdom that we now know as, or we call Mesopotamia. In modern day, this is an area that sort of covers Iraq and Syria. Now in the early 1900s and late 1800s, I'm sure you're aware of the sort of booming archaeological exploration, and actually they were doing a lot of exploration in that part of the world. Now they actually uncovered thousands of these clay tablets. Now at the time they couldn't actually read these clay tablets because the language had been long lost, and therefore they didn't actually know what they had discovered or what the information was about. Now over the decades later, they actually were able to uncover what was written in these clay tablets. And they actually found that some of these were medical texts. Now I've probably put a picture of an example of a reproduction of one of those clay tablets on the screen now. Now within those texts, and again they're quite fragmented because they are 4,500 years old, but there was some information about symptoms of disease, the types of natural products that they were using, and how patients were actually taking them at the time. Now there's an excerpt that I'd like to read to you from one of the clay tablets, from one of the products they were actually using. So the information states that they would pulverize the seeds of the carpenter plant, they'd add this to the gum of the marcassi plant, add thyme, and then dissolve in beer, and then they would drink it. Now unfortunately for this formulation, it doesn't actually tell us what they were taking it for, but our knowledge of what the carpenter plant could be used for, the most likely thing it was for probably pain at this stage, though it could be used for a few other things. Now all the information is very fragmented, again because of the age of the material, but it really starts to build this really early picture of them having what we would classify as sort of some pharmacy or pharmaceutical knowledge about how to uncover what a plant does and how they formulate it into something that someone can actually take. Now for our next real discovery, we need to jump forward by about 2,000 years, which I can do very quickly. So at this point we find ourselves in ancient Egypt, hence the pyramids around me, and I've got Horus and Anubis floating around my head. Now again we have archaeology to thank for a lot of this knowledge, as from around the early 1800s to the 1900s, obviously there was a lot of excavation of the pyramids and tombs, and they found a huge amount of papyrus. Now this is obviously the written work of the time. Now the most important papyrus that was found relevant to pharmacy was actually the Ebers papyrus, so it's named after George Ebers, who was the German Egyptologist who found, or his team found, this particular papyrus. Now the story goes, and whether this is true or not is up for debate, is that this particular papyrus was found between the legs of a mummy in the El Asif region, which is in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor. This papyrus is actually a huge document. It's touted to be around 22 yards long in total. And this papyrus, again, it took a long time to actually decipher the hieroglyphs. So when it was found in 1850, again, they couldn't read it. It wasn't until nearer the turn of the century in the 1900s where they could actually read what was written. So at the point, George Ebers had no idea what he had his hands on at the time. When they were able to break it down, they actually found that the papyrus, again, was a medical text, and it contained around 800 different pharmaceutical formulations, spread of around 700 different drugs, formulated in lots of different ways. This is quite important as it showed some of the knowledge that the Egyptians had gained at this point. So these formulations were spread across things such as inhalations, so sort of the precursor to our inhalers. They had shown that they could make things like suppositories and infusions, ointments for the skin. They developed ingestible formulations such as pills. Now, they hadn't invented the tablet at this point, so their pills, I suppose, are similar to what we'd see as a kind of capsule in terms of its form. Now, many of the drugs that were actually detailed within this papyrus are plant or mineral based, unsurprisingly. They didn't have synthetic chemistry at this stage, so they were using the natural products that they had around them. So there are reports of them using things like acacia, fennel, poppy seeds, and minerals such as things like iron and sulfur in their products. Now, what's quite interesting and an advancement over what was found in Babylonian times was that the Egyptians seemed to have a knowledge of dosage. So in those earlier texts that I'd spoken about earlier, there was no sort of correlation between amounts being taken. That's not to say they didn't have that knowledge, but it isn't reported. But in the Egyptians, we have some quite sophisticated and detailed dosage information. So they knew that taking certain amounts of certain products would elicit a certain effect. Now, you can actually visit this papyrus if you ever find yourselves in Leipzig in Germany. The University of Leipzig actually holds the papyrus, and you can see parts of it. It's actually held up fairly well to the test of time. And that leaves us with where we are in ancient Egypt. Now, again, we're going to jump forward a little bit in time and find ourselves in ancient Greece with our next real sort of breakthroughs in pharmacy. So now we find ourselves in ancient Greece. So we're about 1,000 years on from where we were in ancient Egypt. So we're looking at the years around 800 BC to the early AD years, really, is where ancient Greece kind of spans. And the ancient Greeks were very important because they were actually really good at documenting what they did. So they were advanced in writing, and they kept very good records of what they were doing at the time. Ancient Greece was much easier for us to translate, so it meant that we had a much better idea of what was happening in ancient Greece, probably slightly earlier on than we would for some of the previous civilizations. Now, ancient Greece is the first place where we really start to see pharmacy branch away from probably the subject of medicine or physiology at this stage. And they started to sort of isolate almost the start of chemistry, I suppose, or chemicals within plants causing particular activities. Now, lots of the famous Greek philosophers at the time were involved in this kind of subject or similar subjects. So we've got people like Pythagoras. Obviously, Pythagoras is much more commonly known for his work on the triangle. We all know the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But he also worked in other areas of science and maths. So Pythagoras actually noted that the time that you collected a plant in its life cycle, so from when it's first grown to when it's almost at the end of its life, would change its effect on someone if they ingest it, or they take it, or they use it in another way. So he started to note that it was something particular within a plant and within its life cycle that has that activity on the body. And this is quite important because now we're starting to say that they're starting to note that there's something within a plant, a herb, that's actually causing the activity, and it's not necessarily the whole plant that's causing the action. Other philosophers such as Empedocles started to look a lot more at equilibrium within the body. So they started to see that if you were deficient in particular things, that would have an effect on the body, and we could replace those deficiencies and actually have a positive effect on disease. Doxoricles again looked at plants specifically, but they started to systematically arrange plants into groups in terms of what their activity was, or groups in terms of the types of side effects they would. So this is the first point in which side effects are really thought about. So it's saying that, yes, this plant has a particular activity, but it might also have some unwanted effects that we don't want. And what are they? So when someone it does take it, is this something that they would particularly expect? Now today, in modern times, we very much systematically arrange drugs, medicines into groups, whether it's for hypertension, so high blood pressure, to other disorders such as renal disease or cancer and all that kind of thing. We very much like to group our drugs into very specific sectors in terms of how they're used. And again, we have long lists of side effects for everything. So Doxorubicles was the first person to really start to make that systematic arrangement and start to group drugs, plants together in terms of what they can be used for. And that's a really useful source that we still kind of use today, I suppose. Now, probably one of the important breakthroughs of the time was done by Galen. So Galen's quite a famous Greek physician, philosopher, which I'm sure most people have heard of. He's very famous for his work on the four humours, which obviously we know to be incorrect, but at the time was very much the most up-to-date sort of science that they were working with. Now he identified that his work with plants and herbs, that it wasn't the whole herb and the whole plant that was actually causing effects on the body. It was something within that plant, a very specific entity, which was causing the activity that we wanted. Now today this is pretty much what we do when we look at natural products and we try and extract a specific chemical, because we know that it's not the whole plant that causes the activity normally, it's a very specific chemical within that plant which causes that action. And that's what Galen started to know. He started to look at extracting chemicals from plants and noting that it's with these specific chemicals that was having an effect on the body. Also, Galen started to look at things like quantitative testing of medicines, which is fairly sophisticated for the times, again looking at how dosages affects activity. Now in ancient Egypt they were starting to sort of investigate this and work with that kind of concept, but in ancient Greece they are very systematic in the way the terms they researched these sorts of subjects. So it's really important that he started to bring this quantitative testing measures for medicines. Now, alongside ancient Greece, we obviously have ancient Rome as well. These two societies are very closely linked in terms of the types of information they had. A lot of information was spread between these two. So they had very similar ideas in terms of medicine at this stage, hence why I'm not necessarily focusing on ancient Rome here. But just to say that at this point we're starting to see some quite big leaps forward in record keeping, so we have a much better idea of what they were doing at the times. And actually the science was starting to get a lot more sophisticated, and they're starting to have a better idea of some of the concepts that we now obviously know today. Unfortunately, this all seems good and it seems like rapid advancements, but it wasn't all quite plain sailing from this point forward, as I will explain to you next. The main reason for this was actually the fall of the Roman Empire. You might not think that should have a huge impact on science, but it really did input the development of science, especially in Europe, but actually throughout the world to a certain extent, back a long time. So the Roman Empire fell in around 500 AD, and that brought around the time, or the medieval period, or the time that we sort of classically call as the Dark Ages. This period of time was pretty much where travel almost stopped between countries. There was a lot of infighting throughout the world, and really a lot of the knowledge that had been gained and built throughout those sort of ancient periods were really lost at this point. So if you take Britain, for instance, we became very isolated from the rest of the world at this stage. We didn't travel, we were at war a lot, and again we lost a lot of those skills that we had gained from those sort of ancient times before us. In this point we kind of classically think that pharmacy and science kind of regressed. In reality science continued, but the knowledge was not as well recorded. They again were starting from scratch with a lot of points, so again they didn't really advance at all from what a lot of the earlier workings that we had, even though their knowledge of plants and effects on the body was still there. They still had that kind of classical knowledge that had been passed down, but its kind of strategic use was a lot reduced at this point. Now, this didn't last forever, obviously, so the end of the medieval period we generally class as around 1100 AD. So it took around 1,000 years, maybe not quite 1,000 years, 600 years of kind of not a lot happening, I suppose, in the terms of advancement in science. Now, as we enter sort of the 12th century, trade and travel started to happen again. So we started to pass knowledge from different sectors again. We started to bring in products from abroad. We started to learn from other nations around the world, and obviously we started to impart our own knowledge as well. And that really reignited science as a whole, and in particular pharmacy and chemistry. Probably the most important person that we kind of talk about in this sort of period of time is a scientist called Paracelsus. So we're looking at around the late 1400s here. So Paracelsus was quite an interesting man. Please have a look at his kind of works if you're interested in this kind of thing. He worked in a lot of areas of science. He was still very much interested in things like bloodletting. So again, he still had some things that were still very misconceived in science at this point. But what he started to do is he started to almost begin the area of synthetic chemistry. So he started to note that we could synthetically produce molecules that were found in the natural world. And that's pretty much where we are today. You know, we can very much recreate products that are found naturally, and we can modify them synthetically to produce better effects. And that's kind of where he really started. He started to note that he could start to make things synthetically that before we weren't able to do. And that is really the start of pharmaceutical chemistry, I suppose, as we know it today. Now, there are lots of other important scientists and alike around those periods of time that were involved in pharmacy or areas of pharmacy. So even people like Leonardo da Vinci, obviously everyone knows about Leonardo da Vinci. They know mainly that his work on anatomy, but he did actually do some work towards chemistry and pharmacy, looking at the effects of products on the body. Other scientists from around Europe, such as Vesalius and Marcanini. So Vesalius was a Dutch scientist, Marcanini was Italian. They were very much trying to make links now between anatomy and physiology, so what classically fits into medicine, and the effects of chemicals on those disorders and disease. So they were starting to really push the boundaries in terms of what we knew about pharmacy at this stage, or sort of chemical sciences. So they were really important in pushing forward the boundaries, and this happened throughout what we call the Renaissance period, so the sort of 14th century to the 17th century, in terms of those real advancements again. Strangely enough, that in this period of time, they actually looked back and were really reworking a lot of that ancient Greek information. So they had access to the texts and they were using and rereading that sort of information, and it really did guide them back to where we were almost 1,000 years before. And this really now, as manufacturing was starting to become more sophisticated, we were able to make quicker advances in the realms of science and chemistry, and then in particular pharmacy. So where does this lead us to at this stage? So at this point in time, very much seeing an improvement in chemistry. We're starting to understand molecules' activity on the body. We're starting to isolate natural products and synthetically produce our own. This still left a little bit of work to do in the area of formulation, I suppose. So our knowledge of the activity of a compound was improving, but actually how we ingested them didn't really change massively from what they were doing in the ancient times, I suppose, in terms of how we were putting formulations together. This probably brings us up towards probably one of the biggest breakthroughs and is seen in pharmacy, and something that we still use today, which was the invention of the humble tablet, I suppose. So the original tablet press was developed in 1843 by William Brockledon, and he invented the first tablet press. Before this time, they were much more crude products, where they would mash together a thickening agent with a powder and then try and form it in kind of a free mold to produce an oral sort of capsule tablet that you could take. But it wasn't until the 1840s where we sort of had our advancements in mechanical engineering, where we were able to start to mass produce tablets on a big scale. This is very important because tablets are the most commonly used, widely distributed pharmaceutical in the world. They're the easiest to take, they're the most useful. And it has its origins almost 200 years ago now. So it was this first invention that was really important in actually widely distributing drugs now throughout the world. So this very much brings us to what we would class now as the modern age of science, I suppose, or the modern age of pharmacy, if you want to call it that way. And this is actually where I'm going to finish my timeline today. I could continue over the last 150 years. There have been so many developments, we could also have a whole video about that, and I may do that as well, so maybe we can get that linked to you at a later date. So a lot of what I've done or spoken about today has really been about the focus of the science of pharmacy and where it's all come from. But obviously there's a lot of information about pharmacy as a profession throughout history as well. So originally pharmacy would have been called an apothecary, and these were run by specialist practitioners, so this is very much what we would recognise today as being a pharmacist. So that dates back to around the 13th century in terms of that as a term. Now in popular culture there have been references to apothecaries for a long time, so you can go back to the Canterbury Tales written by Geoffrey Chaucer, or even Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, where there are references to apothecaries. Even Harry Potter, slightly more recent, makes quite strong links to that sort of apothecary past, I suppose. If that's a subject you're interested in, please do have a look. There's lots of information about that as well. Again, I may do a separate video which I'll link to you if possible at a later date as well. So that just leads me to say that I've actually found this a really interesting video for me to do. So looking back at the history of pharmacy is not something that we do particularly often. We're normally looking at how we move forward, but actually it's really good to take a step back and look about how the development has really come from, because we can learn a lot from that. So that wraps up this session. So that just leaves me to say thank you all for listening. I do appreciate you spending your time to listen to me today. I hope you've learned a little bit about the history of pharmacy, and then that is goodbye from me.